Scottish independence, what is it? What does it mean? Is it needed? How can it be done? How can it be achieved? What are the determinants? What are the barriers? These are all major issues.
The last few years have been very interesting in terms of independence and the campaign for, and the arguments for and against. But what became clear to me was that there was a need to better explain what independence is and why it's needed. In this respect, I ended up writing a book called The Socio-Political Determinants of Scottish Independence. My background is in business studies, as a professor of business, and I've been able to develop theoretical frameworks for a number of studies, and this was what I was able to do in the context of Scottish independence, to develop a theoretical framework for my book, Dún Hodden, The Socio-Political Determinants of Scottish Independence. The term Dún Hodden is the Scots term for oppression. So what we are going to cover here is really what we mean by independence. Why is Scotland not an independent country? Why should Scotland be independent? What factors are important in this regard? What are the main barriers to independence? What are the main opportunities? So what are really the determinants of independence? We're often told that policies and this and that are enough to satisfy people to decide one way or another, but my findings of the research in the area suggest that that's not sufficient. So what's been done here is to draw out a theoretical framework which is basically ground out of the data, what we term grounded theory method.
In this research, what I found is that the key factors are some of the things we might least expect. Culture, language, which together form our identity. Then we have other aspects that people don't generally talk about, like nationalism, colonialism. These issues, we don't talk about demographics. It's people that vote. And here we have a population that's continually changing. So we have many factors that combine, socio-political factors that combine to hold Scotland in the Union or to allow it to leave.
So here's the framework, and there's 9 determinants which I've been able to analyse in some detail. We'll go through now. Culture, language, demographics, colonialism, nationalism, institutions, constitution, ethnicity and self-determination. The framework basically sets out these as areas that require further investigation and analysis to explore the phenomenon of Scottish independence.
Culture is who we are, it's how we think, it's what we do. It's also related to our language, and particularly important here is the Scots language, which gives us, together it gives us our national consciousness. Without our national consciousness, there's no desire for nationhood. National consciousness is then built on the culture and language we have. That is who we are, that's why we want independence.
So let's look firstly at culture. Culture is our customs and beliefs transmitted through language. Cultural imperialism involves promoting the culture and language of one nation in another or other countries. Cultural imperialism enforces and reinforces what is effectively an alien culture hegemony on a people. This also relates to the theory of enculturation. In our case, an Anglophone elite culture is imposed on Scots speakers. This leads in turn to what we know as the Scottish cultural cringe, which is a feeling of cultural inadequacy and even self-hatred. We have, therefore, what some regard as an illusion of culture, which is a primary tool used by elites to retain power. Culture and identity are very closely connected, and independence is regarded in post-colonial literature as basically a fight for a national culture. Scottish independence in this sense is dependent on national culture, national consciousness.
So why are we not taught our Scots language? What is linguistic imperialism? What is linguicide? Are these factors that are common to imperial powers in any colonialism project? The first thing to do is to take the indigenous languages and cast them aside, whether it's Gaelic or Scots. And in my case it's the Scots language, which I most identify with, and according to the census 1.6 million Scots. That's what we speak, but when we arrive in schools we're not taught it. It's driven out of us. We're made into Anglophones. Why is that? Is that linguistic imperialism? Does it change our identity?
Indigenous language is the basis of the identity of any people, the mother tongue, as we might say. Language and culture intersect to form identities. Language also defines and unites a nation. So linguistic imperialism in this regard marginalises and seeks to destroy indigenous language. The aim of linguistic imperialism is basically linguistic genocide, or what we know as linguicide. And the removal of a language, whether it's Scots or Gaelic or whatever, is intentional. Loss of language therefore undermines our sense of identity and belonging. Language and culture give us our national consciousness. Language policy, however, in Scotland aims to deprive Scots of the Scots language, which is a common feature of colonialism, linguistic policy and linguistic imperialism, which gives rise to the reality globally that language is the most common rationale for self-determination of a people.
Scotland's population is changing all the time. Scotland lost between 3 and 4 million people since the Union. That's one of the biggest, if not the biggest, losses of population of any similar sized country in Western Europe. At the same time, we were importing people, mostly from the rest of the UK, mainly from England, and mostly in the professional classes. So, whilst many Scots were leaving Scotland because of poverty, poor housing, poor opportunities, or no opportunities, mostly in the working classes, we're often given incentives to leave Scotland, between 3 and 4 million of them. At the same time, we were importing a meritocracy, mostly Anglophone, mostly taking the professional jobs. So Scotland's population has changed fundamentally, even since devolution. There's something like 50,000 people a year coming from the rest of the UK to live in Scotland. That's 1 million people in 20 years. That's a vast, vast change in the population. And it's people at the end of the day that vote. And they vote on the basis of their culture and identity. And that explains, to some extent, why today many people vote against independence.
We then move to demographics. It's people that vote at the end of the day, and population is very important in that regard. And loss of sovereignty usually implies loss of control over borders and population, which is what Scotland has been subject to for 300 years or more. So between 1870 and 1930, Scotland lost 2 million of its people in barely 60 years. And overall in the Union, between 3 and 4 million Scots have left Scotland, which was the largest loss of people in Western Europe for a country of our size. The largest ethnic migrant group coming into Scotland is people from England. Outbound, historically, we have seen mainly the loss of working class Scots speakers emigrating to many different countries, whereas inbound, it's mainly been a professional class, primarily from England. This leads to, in general colonialism literature, what we term an ethnic division of labour, which is linguistically and culturally determined. In effect, since the Union, a large portion of the Scottish population has been displaced. The outcome from this is also related to economic underdevelopment, which parallels linguistic underdevelopment. So Scotland has been subjected to a high degree of population displacement and replacement, primarily due to loss of sovereignty. The main issue with this in terms of independence, of course, is that people of rest of UK heritage are the least likely to vote for independence, the very high propensity to oppose independence, which relates to the nature of the importance of identity, culture and language and national consciousness.
Brexit kind of demonstrated that Scotland's a bit of a colony. There we voted to stay in the EU, but were dragged out, so it didn't really matter what we said. Treated like a colony, but what is a colony? Well, the three dimensions of colonialism are: one, that a country or a people are economically plundered and exploited. The second factor is they're politically controlled, which seems to be the case with Scotland, politically controlled by another country. And the third dimension is occupation by settlers. There's also the theory of internal colonialism, which affects the Celtic periphery within the UK. And in that respect, internal colonialism demonstrates a different economic future for the Celtic periphery, Scotland, Wales and Ireland at one time. A different economic status, a different economic growth, different economic opportunities, and also a cultural division of labour. But at the end of the day, it's still colonialism.
Scotland's enforced EU exit demonstrated, despite having been a signatory to the Treaty of Union and sovereignty in Scotland, it demonstrated a rather colonial status politically. Colonialism is defined as external political control, economic exploitation and plundering, and settler occupation, and arguably Scotland is subject to all three of these features. There's also the theory, post-colonial literature gives us the definition and the discussion of what's known as internal colonialism in reference to the UK core country and its Celtic periphery. And here also the results of that research was to define a cultural division of labour, economic underdevelopment of the periphery nations, and the rise of independence movements reflecting ethnic solidarity of Indigenous Scots speakers in our case. In this respect, devolution initiatives are something of a colonial bone thrown to restless regions and countries. So in effect, if colonialism features highly in the context of Scottish independence, we then get into the realms of the UN literature on decolonisation, where the independence of a people is defined as decolonisation.
Is Scottish independence about nationalism? Post-colonial theorists say the most important thing about independence is national consciousness, but they say that's not nationalism. When we look at nationalism, we see that nationalism can also be transnational nationalism. That's one dominant country taking over other countries. And we might regard that as really where the UK is, because transnational nationalism also involves imposing culture, language and political control over other territories. So Scottish independence is not really about nationalism per se, it's about national consciousness, because without that there's no motivation for national independence. And it's about overcoming a British national or nationalism ideology, which is about subjugation and suppression of other cultures.
Independence depends primarily on national consciousness, not nationalism. In some respects, Scots remain today with something like something of a confused sense of identity between Scottishness and Britishness. But the British Union in nationalism terms reflects transnational nationalism, which seeks to impose on Scotland a British one nation ideology. It involves cultural and linguistic imperialism, and it involves economic exploitation. Independence, on the other hand, is self-determination nationalism, if it is nationalism at all. Civic nationalism, which has been discussed in Scotland, depends on a desire for citizenship and belonging, and it's rather premature to offer civic nationalism to a country that doesn't yet have the ability to offer citizenship. Independence is therefore anti-colonial nationalism and self-determination, whereas British nationalism is a transnational nationalist ideology.
Every country is run by institutions. But who runs Scotland's institutions? We have what we call an establishment. Because we have a cultural division of labour in Scotland, most of that establishment is run by an elite that's largely Anglophone, largely unionist. And according to other reports recently, come from rather a narrow area of life, private schools, elite universities. That's where our establishment derives from.
Scotland is controlled by, through its cultural division of labour, an Anglophone unionist establishment. The meritocratic elite reflects, therefore, a cultural division of labour. This creates and depends on socio-linguistic prejudice, particularly against Scots speakers. It leads to social exclusion of ethnic Scots speakers and especially the working class, who comprise most of the Scots speakers. This results in discrimination becoming institutionalised within society. Scotland's education is also subject to a high degree of segregation, particularly in the context of private schools, which are mainly used by the more privileged elements of society, which are more Anglophone, and also the elite universities. The latter having a large focus on educating students from overseas based on higher fee income. The health impacts of this cultural and economic underdevelopment are significant for the Scottish people. These include social inequalities and poverty, a schizoid personality, lacking in confidence, and also depression and anxiety. In terms of the outcome of a cultural division of labour.
Constitutionally, of course, Scotland's not a colony. Scotland has a treaty, the Treaty of Union, that created the UK alliance. Scotland's also a sovereign people. A sovereign people in a treaty is very important under international law. It means that a sovereign party to a treaty can withdraw from that treaty, according to the International Court. So what's to stop Scotland withdrawing from the treaty just as easily as it entered into the treaty? And that's an important point that's never really been pushed or tested in recent years.
Well, it's always been accepted by Westminster and politicians and Prime Ministers of the UK that a majority of nationalist members of Parliament could withdraw Scotland from the treaty.
And that's basically what Alex Salmond's Alba Party is recommending now, that a supermajority at Holyrood can withdraw Scotland from the UK Union lawfully and can begin negotiations to withdraw.
Although Scotland is politically treated pretty much as a colony, the Constitution suggests otherwise, in that the 1707 Treaty of Union created the present UK alliance. Scotland remains a signatory party to that treaty. Unilateral withdrawal from a treaty under international law is a matter for each signatory party. Scotland's sovereignty is acknowledged by Holyrood and Westminster, and the fact remains that treaties are only upheld so long as they remain in the national interest. When they are no longer in the national interest, then they are ended, and that is the international reality. We also know that a referendum is not a requirement as a matter of law for Scotland's independence. In effect, Scotland's national representatives hold Scotland's political sovereignty at any given time. The Alba Party strategy, looking for a supermajority to negotiate independence, therefore fits in with the reality of the treaty and the sovereignty of the Scottish people.
When we talk about ethnicity, human geography tells us that there are very many ethnic groups And in Scotland there's many ethnic migrant groups. Scotland within the UK is an ethnic minority. And Scots speakers within Scotland are now a minority group, largely because the language isn't taught in schools as it should be, according to the European Council. So the fact that their ethnicity exists, it's an important aspect, it shouldn't be ignored. And what I've found in my research is that the ethnic issues that affecting Scotland within the Union are quite severe. The first aspect of this is to do with ethnic discrimination, which, because there is the socio-linguistic prejudice prevalent in Scotland with an Anglophone hegemony running Scotland, then this prejudice is against the Scots speaker, plus the fact that Scots language isn't taught in schools adds to that discrimination. The second factor, perhaps more important as well, is the likelihood then that a people develop what's known as appropriated racial oppression, which is also known as internalised racism. We know it as the Scottish cultural cringe. It's where a people accept their inferiority, their inferior language, their inferior status, their deprivation, their poverty, the lack of opportunity. They accept that as deserved, which it's not, but they accept it as that. And they also lack the confidence to run their own affairs. And this is why many Scots today vote against independence. It's the development of appropriated racial oppression, which many oppressed peoples, colonised peoples around the world have been subjected to as a common feature.
The ethnic discrimination of Scots speakers and culture is a reality within a colonial situation. The Union, through Anglo domination, has created the Scottish cultural cringe. Ethnic discrimination then becomes normalised, which limits personal and intellectual freedoms. This colonialism itself is, of course, racism and worse, in fact, prejudice. This also leads to, within a people, what's known as internalised racism or appropriated racial oppression. And here the people appropriate negative stereotypes given to them by the elite power, and their subordination and deprivation is considered to be largely deserved. This also involves devaluation of one's own ethnic group and patterns of thinking which support maintaining the status quo. The oppressed group members also in some cases seek conformity with oppressor group culture, and to discard their own culture and language is a part of this too. So ethnic identity is largely destroyed through cultural and linguistic imperialism, which is its purpose, to remove a culture and identity and language. High levels of appropriated racial oppression explain why many ethnic Scots, even today, still oppose independence.
Self-determination is the right of any people, any defined people, under the UN Charter. The UN regards colonialism as a scourge, a form of punishment that should be ended. So it allows for countries and peoples to determine their own future through what's known as self-determination. A lot depends in Scotland's case on whether it needs that process, or whether or not sovereignty and the existence of a treaty is sufficient to end a union alliance, as would be expected.
And self-determination is a cardinal principle of the UN Charter. The definition of a people, and this is based on aspects such as tradition, culture, ethnicity, history, heritage, language, religion, sense of identity, the will to constitute a people, and any common suffering. Self-determination, according to the UN, is also decolonisation. Key in the self-determination process is that there should be no external interference, No other countries or peoples should be involved. No external media influence should be involved. And the voter franchise should only include the people, the defined people seeking self-determination. Scotland has a slight problem here in that it is using a local government franchise for national elections and national referendums, which is highly irregular. The self-determination process, however, is mainly relevant for colonies, whereas Scotland remains a sovereign signatory party to a treaty alliance and should be able to enter and leave treaty alliances as it wishes. So that's the framework, the political determinants of Scottish independence. These are all the key factors determining Scotland either maintaining its status within the UK alliance or achieving independence. And within the framework, it shows there are pressures for and against this. So what conclusions might we come to here? It's clear that independence is never dependent on general policy matters such as economics or defence or pensions or whatever. Independence of a people is dependent primarily on national consciousness and identity, without which there is no momentum for independence. The basis of this is language and culture, which forms identity. The difficulty arises today in that Scotland's population has a mixed and in some cases confused identity, which is no accident given the objective of cultural and linguistic imperialism is to change the identity of a people. Fundamentally, though, the Scots' choice is between liberation and assimilation and subjugation, which is the colonial reality of the situation. Independence ultimately is a fight for a people's national culture as well as a quest for their economic and political independence. In this respect, the ALBA supermajority strategy, based on the sovereignty of the people and the fact of the treaty-based alliance, allows the people to negotiate independence as a valid and lawful method of withdrawal from the UK alliance.
Scottish independence is really a very important matter in respect of the survival of a culture and a nation. Because in colonialism, the only two choices are independence or assimilation. So the Scots have to figure that out. If that's what they want, that's what they can vote for. If they can vote themselves out of existence by voting against independence, that is exactly what they'll do. So that's the choice: independence, liberation, or assimilation, oppression.